Welcome, everyone. I am Vicky Murillo, the director of the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this conference, Rethinking Nature and Society in Latin America. We have today the pleasure of having our third panel. This is the second session of the conference, and it will continue next Friday. I have the pleasure to introduce Ronald Gregg, who's the chair of this panel, Sensing and Recreating Nature. Ron?
Thank you, Vicky. Welcome to everyone. And before I introduce our first panelists, just to remind you that whether you're in the room with us or you're watching this through YouTube, please leave questions or comments that we will incorporate into the discussion after the presentations of the three papers.
Thank you, Ron.
Again,
thank you, Ron. I forgot to say that for the questions in the YouTube, you have to write the questions in the comment section and somebody will bring them to by chat to the conversation here. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, Vicky, for explaining that further for me. But thanks to the organizers, and I think we have a wonderful panel for you today. And so I'm going to immediately move to the panel. And the first paper is by Alex Albero, who's the Virginia Bloedel Wright Professor of Modern and Contemporary Art History at Barnard College and Columbia University. He is the founding editor of the University of California Press's book series, Studies on Latin American Art, and sits on the editorial boards of several journals. His books include Abstraction in Reverse, Institutional Critique, Conceptual Art, and the Politics of Publicity, and numerous others. He is presently completing a book-length study, The Shape of Contemporary Art, that focuses on the relationship between art and the geography of globalization. And Alex's paper is on Paulo Tavares's non-human rights and matters of concern. Alex, it's yours.
Thank you, Ron. That was a very nice introduction. Get the PowerPoint going. And thank you, Vicky, and everybody who's organized this conference. It's going to be a great pleasure to follow it as it develops beyond today. Now that the semester's finally over, it'll be easier. My paper, as you can see, Paulo Tavares's Non-Human Rights and Matters of Concern. Now, Paulo Tavares's artworks emphasize concerns over facts or forms. The Brazilian artist-architects projects expand the subjects they investigate to focus concertedly on context. Tavares questions ecologies, subjugated knowledge, imperializing perspectives, and grossly exploited terrains. His art exposes the links between extractive industries, research and development, and environmental catastrophes, and develops perspectives to respond to the existing conditions. The perspectives prioritize ontology over sociological or anthropological epistemes, let alone those of political science. This change of outlook or orientation contorts the lines between the human position and its others and proposes multiple ontologies. Tavares adopts the concept of concern from science scholar Bruno Latour's writings. A matter of concern, Latour clarifies, describes issues around which people gather shared focus. It is what happens to a matter of fact when one adds to it its whole scenography, much like one would do by shifting one's attention from the stage to the whole machinery of a theater. Matters of fact emerge out of matters of concern. To study objects is to study complex gatherings or assemblages that make those objects. It is to turn institutions, technologies, people, and physical artifacts into things, to turn matters of concern into fact. Tavares has found in Latour's notion of concern a way out of the distinction between objective and subjective matters. When seen from the highly complex, historically situated, and richly diverse perspective of concern, scientific facts lose their grip as the singular basis of truth. Non-human nature becomes part of political life. Facts start to render different sound. They start to move in all sorts of different directions. They overflow their boundaries. They include a complete set of new actors. They reveal the fragile envelopes in which they're housed. In short, for Tavares, as for Latour, concerns highlight the contingency of facts, revealing their partially constructed and subjective nature. They open facts to various interests and render them disputable and political. Realities exist, but they are neither unproblematic nor singular. Human and non-human actors experimentally constitute them as ensembles of practices. This turn in perspective troubles teleological notions of progress. Tavares has embraced a broadened notion of rights that includes non-human entities such as the Earth's various ecosystems. The belief that modernity's anthropocentrism has resulted in innumerable environmental and social cataclysms, and that the crisis has recently reached epic proportions, underlies his work. The artist rejects the idea that nature's usefulness to humans should define its value. Take his project work, Non-Human Rights, of 2012. Initially conceived for the exhibition Animism at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin, the video and text piece, which Tavares has also uploaded onto an open online multimedia platform, presents this struggle over the definition of nature as one of the most contentious political conflicts of our era. The text singles in on two paradigmatic environmental debacles: the 1986 accident of the number 4 nuclear reactor in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill off the coast of Alaska. These disasters, Tavares claims, shook nature's categorical foundations. The artist notes the critical role mass media coverage of these events played in focusing public attention on an environmental crisis in the making. The two catastrophes, he argues, prompted many to question for the first time humans' reliance on nature for more than just raw materials. They made plain that disruptions in the infrastructures humans have superimposed on nature's interconnected web of living processes and ecosystems generate crises that affect the entire planet. Non-Human Rights' video and text components then relate these environmental disasters to alternate epistemologies of Amerindian politics, and in particular to political uprisings by Ecuador's indigenous population in the 1990s. The uprisings radically shifted the country's national politics and sent emancipation waves throughout the Andes. Ecuador's social turmoil culminated in the government rewriting the country's constitution to include a law that grants nature 3 inalienable legal rights: precaution, reparation, and protection. The indigenous movement initially demanded a new national agreement that treated its constituency as fully enfranchised subject citizens.
Porque los derechos de la naturaleza hay que verlos dentro de un proceso histórico de emancipación de la humanidad, de ampliación permanente de derechos.
Alberto Acosta, president of the assembly responsible for writing the 2008 Ecuadorian constitution and one of the keynote speakers at this conference in mid-May, clarifies in Non-Human Rights that since the distinction between humans and nature doesn't exist in the Andean Amerindian cosmology, granting rights to the indigenous population requires granting rights to nature too. By extending legal standing to mountains and seas, rocks and rainforests, the new ecocentric law dissolves the boundaries between worlds of matter and cycles of life, human subjects and non-human objects, agents of law and industry resources. As Tavares notes, this legal transformation represents nothing less than a radically new universalism. It inaugurates a new, legally recognized subjectivity shared by all life forms and their life-sustaining biosphere. The new subjectivity radically proposes a decolonization of nature from centuries of domination. The social movements that pushed for environmental justice didn't follow the traditional anthropocentric path of socialism. Instead, they represent what Acosta describes as biocentric socialism, a socialism of the sumak kausai, referring to the Quechua word for buen vivir, living well, which connotes harmony between social communities and the natural environment. When we speak of the community, Quechuan politician Luis Macas clarifies, we speak of both the human and the natural community. They are never separate. This is the Pacha, or La Pachamama, Mother Earth. The idea of Pachamama is guided by various elements, among which is the principle of relationality. We believe everything is interrelated. According to Macas, modernity's high crime is to have appropriated the natural resources which are part of life itself. The natural resources are fundamental to everyone, to the human as well as natural community. For us, nature is not an object, but a subject. Macas is quick to add, though, that the political project of the indigenous movement in the Andes isn't one that comes exclusively from indigenous people. It's a project that's emerging gradually from questioning the reality of indigenous peoples, of the Afro-descendants, of mestizos. The struggles of the indigenous, of peasants, and of urban workers have been converging, slowly coming together in decolonizing the intellectual schemes of the Western and Eurocentric system, close quote. Macas's notion of decolonization refers to extricating and disentangling from modernity's colonial structures of thought. It signifies the attempt to recuperate and reassert the power of subjugated knowledge, repressed by the ontological domination of a Western philosophy based on the inferiority of others, naturales and nature alike. Scenes of rural protesters and landscapes devastated by oil and mineral extraction alternate in non-human rights with quotations from Michel Serres' 1990 book, The Natural Contract. The history of science scholar calls for negotiating an official agreement between Earth and its inhabitants. In this radical redefinition of fundamental rights under law, land, rivers, mountains, and wildlife all have equal standing. Granting rights to nature has led to juridical battles around toxic waste in the Ecuadorian Amazon. It has also led to litigation around the most massive marine oil spill in the petroleum industry's history, the Deepwater Horizon disaster that began in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico on the British petroleum-operated Macondo prospect rig. Following the Deepwater calamity, Ecuadorian indigenous activists and a team of international lawyers submitted a lawsuit against British Petroleum to the Constitutional Court of Ecuador under the principle of universal jurisdiction. As Esperanza Martinez, a member of this legal team, explains in Non-Human Rights, when we talk about the oil spill as a violation of the rights of Pachamama, what we're saying is that the principle of nature recognized by the Ecuadorian Constitution is not limited to the geographical borders of Ecuador and its trees and plants, but that it extends to Pachamama. It's not exactly the same as the idea of universal jurisdiction, which was formulated in relation to crimes against humanity, but it allows for a critical reflection on crimes that affect not just the whole of humanity, but existence itself, the entire planet. From a juridical perspective, many have found the idea that a non-human entity such as nature could have rights to be untenable. Anthropocentric assumptions run deep. This implausibility has resulted in extensive legal discussions and a lively public debate that continues into the present. But as Acosta argues, the rights of nature have to be seen within the larger historical process of the emancipation of humanity as a permanent expansion of rights. Remember, he continues, remember the indigenous didn't have any rights. At the beginning of the conquest, they were believed to be an extension of the animal world. Remember, slaves didn't have any rights, women didn't have any rights, and children didn't have any rights. These rights were gradually won, and each step was met with resistance. Mario Mello, one of the leading lawyers of the NGO Fundación Pachamama, takes a slightly different approach to defend the extension of rights to nature. He reminds the viewer of non-human rights of the legal personhood status that corporations commonly enjoy. There are entities in our Western system that are not human, he observes, that do not even have a real existence, but do have rights like juridical persons. Corporations, for instance, have rights. They're defined by law as fictitious persons, though they are in fact just an amount of capital. So if fictitious persons have rights, why not nature, whose existence is indisputable? In Non-Human Rights, Tavares deploys images within a critical documentary essayistic format that presents nature as a legal subject, a legal animism, so to speak, no longer existing as mere material for industry, commerce, and economic growth. The discourse touches on what Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro refers to as Amerindian multinaturalism. Distinct from multiculturalism, which implies multiple perspectives on a self-same nature, multinaturalism asserts that human and non-human epistemologies, or ways of seeing, are continuous, but that the object of their gazes is different. Unlike the Western mononaturalist episteme that posits a shared, objectively knowable world, Amerindian cosmophilosophy is structured by a universality of mind and a diversity of bodies. Culture is universal and nature is particular. Whereas all beings see the world the same way, they see different worlds. There is not one nature and a multiculturalism of ways of seeing it, but one way of seeing and a multinaturalism of completely different natures. The video concisely captures this perspective in an exchange between Tavares and Martinez. It is said that modernity is a system in which there is one nature and various cultures, right? Tavares asks. Yes, Martinez replies, precisely as many as there are cultures. Let me play this short clip for you.
Al principio se trataba de los derechos de la naturaleza, pero eso ya implicaba una reflexión de qué es la naturaleza. Okay, para la ciencia es una cosa, para los pueblos indígenas es otra, para el derecho es otra, para el capitalismo es otra. Para el capitalismo naturaleza es medio ambiente. Es el lugar en donde uno saca recursos, pone y tiene límites. Para los pueblos indígenas tiene una noción distinta. A los pueblos indígenas la naturaleza no solamente son las otras especies que conviven con el ser humano, digamos, no solamente son los ecosistemas, sino que inclusive son los seres espirituales. Entonces, no estamos hablando de lo mismo. Cuando se decidió acoger el término Pachamama, se decidió primero es un acto de reconocimiento de que quienes saben sobre estos temas son los que están ligados a la tierra. Luego era un acto, de alguna manera, de crítica a las nociones clásicas de medio ambiente, de naturaleza. Entonces, de apertura en la diversidad, de saber que no, digamos, hay que hacer un esfuerzo de interpretación sobre qué vamos a entender por naturaleza. Y cuando los pueblos, digamos, cuando los pueblos indígenas plantean la Pachamama, obviamente no la plantean como el espacio físico, geográfico que está dentro de unas fronteras, para comenzar, porque los pueblos indígenas no reconocen las fronteras nacionales. Hay pueblos que están en un lado y en otro lado de la frontera. Ellos se reconocen como, digamos, lo más parecido es lo que ahora se utiliza, sobre todo en Bolivia y en Ecuador, como la madre tierra, es decir, como una madre así general que alberga a todos. Si la modernidad adoptó un único paradigma, una única racionalidad, un único modelo de naturaleza, lo que se está planteando es que no es uno, son muchos, y que tienen algunos principios generales, que es lo que debemos ser capaces de desentrañar, y dado que la naturaleza tiene derechos de protección, tiene derechos de precaución y de reparación, vamos a ver qué podemos tomar de cada uno de esos principios para que se haga justicia a la naturaleza.
Porque se dice, no, la modernidad es una naturaleza y varias culturas, ¿no? Lo que están haciendo como distinto, hay muchas naturalezas.
Así es, tantas como culturas.
The multinaturalist system of variation decenters human sovereignty over the environment. It activates points of view that extend well beyond the human and acknowledges other beings' perspectives and rights. It diversifies the ontology of nature, which is a good way of describing the political ecological significance of Tavares's non-human rights. Perhaps the most relevant question, Tavares speculates, is not so much how culturally tolerant the enlightened Western-based category of universal humanity can be, but precisely the opposite, how modernity, together with its laws and politics, might accommodate different natures besides and beyond the monolithic version upon which it was constituted. The core political and ethical imperative of Tavares's video and text project, then, is to move beyond Western modernity's fundamentally mono-natural framework, which establishes a market-defined and property-based relation to nature, and to advocate for an ecocentric legal paradigm that posits nature as the subject of rights. And in this manner, non-human rights recognizes multiple agents and perspectives, including those of the non-human, as part of a newfound universality of political commonality, and calls for the extension of legal power to defend the natural environment upon which life on this planet depends. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. What a really wonderful way to open this panel. We'll turn to Ana Maria Ochoa, who is the professor and chair of the Department of Music and faculty member at the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University. Her recent book, Orality, Listening, and Knowledge in 19th Century Colombia, was awarded the Alan Merriman Prize by the Society for Ethnomusicology. She writes on music and cultural policy, for silenced and armed conflict, and genealogies of listening and sound in Latin America and the Caribbean. Her current projects explore the bioacoustics of life and death in colonial histories of the Americas. So Anna, I will turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So first, I'm very grateful to Vicky, to Gustavo, to Esteban, and to everybody that has organized this conference. Thank you so much. I am very grateful too to our panel is supported by the Center for the Study of Social Difference and the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life, which also supports the group Environmental Justice, Belief Systems, and Aesthetic Experiences in Latin America and the Caribbean, which involves all of the members of this panel. I understand this presentation and indeed this conference as a site for listening to each other in order to enact possible conversations across fields, both during the conference and hopefully afterwards as well. So it is in the spirit of enabling this conversation, particularly with regards to the relation between music and sound disciplines and issues of nature, scientists, policymakers, etc., that I organize my conversation in that spirit. So usually we go to conferences and it's music and nature, and we have very little chance to talk across fields. So it is my hope that I'm very grateful for the humanists, but also for the scientists and policymakers that are here in the audience. So in recent years, questions regarding music, sound, and nature have intensified, as in the other arts, as we just saw with Alex's presentation. This intensification is visible in various domains of musical practice, and I begin my talk by enumerating some of them in order to create awareness of how vast the field is. Particularly salient and of public presence is the work of contemporary sound artists who seek a type of activism in sound in order to respond to situations of climate change. As scholar and sound artists such as Fernando Yazeta and Rui Chavez in Brazil point out, this means that in Latin America and the Caribbean, such work has also involved a major critique of first world modes of understanding what is sound art, as well as a critique of related words, such as acoustic ecology, soundscape, ambient art, sound, or even ambient humanities. So a lot of these words are initially coined in different parts, let's say, of Europe or North America. The ones in sound are very North American based, like soundscape, ambient sound. Throughout the 20th century, from the 1940s onward with intensification in the 1970s. So what scholars in Latin America are doing is saying, wait, we were also doing type of similar work, but it doesn't take the same definition, it doesn't take the same form, there is popular music involved, there's questions of street walking, there's a lot of other issues. So there's not only a production in Latin America, but a reconceptualization of what these terms are. Such work involves, on the one hand, the expansion of the notion of composition to include sounds of the environment or of animals, of plants, that are processed technologically and then presented as artistic installations that include recorded sounds, in the hands of sound environmentalists and composers. A second dimension is the historical critique of these terms, as I already said, but also by ethnomusicologists and anthropologists that ethnographically explore how the relation between music, sound, and the environment is sensorially understood in different parts of the world as a mode of knowledge. That is, that this relation between humans and non-humans, the ambient, the person, whatever that is, changes then according to the cultures that one works with. One effect of this is also the global emergence of what are considered, quote, new fields of study: biomusic, zoomusicology, ecomusicology. All those terms then are being used. This also coincides with a growing interest in listening as a phenomenon, with particular characteristics attached to a lot of development of what listening is and how it provokes knowledge about music and sound. And there's also, quote, new field. It's really been present around since the 19th century, but dispersed, and it has become a discipline in the most Foucauldian sense of the word. It has departments, journals, etc., and it's called sound studies, and it's meant to bring together a lot of these dimensions. Other types of interventions involve changing notions of sound and vision and the relation between the sciences and the humanities, and data sonification, for example. We also find more and more ethnographies and historical work regarding the history of the music industry and its relation to toxicity. In short, the theme, music, sound, and nature is huge. It's enormous. It has a lot of participants. It has different types of activities, different types of inquiry, and involves different methods and practices. My specific work has concentrated on questions about the relation between music, sound, and nature in Latin America and the Caribbean. My question originally was a classical post-colonial question, which I was posing in the late 80s and early 1990s, later problematized as decolonial, and today, of course, the term anti-colonial is there making the rounds. And the question was this one: how do disciplinary histories of music differ in Latin America and the Caribbean? For example, when I used to, let me go to my share screen. Can you see that? Let me just go back.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. So, for example, when I used to teach ethnomusicology, introduction to ethnomusicology, none of these people are going to be present. So you have, and maybe several of you might know them as writers rather than musicologists or music thinkers, or anthropologists, Fernando Ortiz, Lidia Cabrera, Alejo Carpentier, Cuban, Mario Andrade, Brazilian, Jose Maria Arguedas from Peru, Manuel Zapata Olivella from Colombia, Cesar Guerra Peixe, Brazilian, and there are many others. This is just a sample. And the idea was that when I began teaching, for example, these people in the United States, when I arrived in the 2003 and still in 2007 and 8, there was very little of the materials they wrote about music translated. That's still true, but less true. So even in Latin America, it had not coalesced that these people were local thinkers about music. And my question was that, what does it mean to think music and sound in Latin America and the Caribbean? Classical post-colonial question, how do I reframe, a discipline that has been understood from the parameters of the North? These people were very involved in public space, in radio. Carpentier produced radio, in creating the sound archives of Latin America, most of them, and in doing recordings of indigenous and Afro-descendant musics, involved in public policy of music copyrights, a lot of intervention in the public sphere, and of theoretical debate. So with this void in mind, I went to the archives to attempt a decolonial history of musical thought in Colombia in particular, especially around issues of documenting indigenous and Afro-descendant modes of sounding and of thinking about sound. I was initially going to concentrate in the early 20th century, but when I went to the radio archives of the National Library in Colombia, I ended up going to materials of the 19th century that were always being cited. And what I found is that the voice and listening are central dimensions of defining what counts as nature and what counts as culture for different peoples at the crossroads of colonial histories. The book that Ron already mentioned is entitled Orality, Listening and Knowledge in 19th Century Colombia. And so what I found in the archive, which I did not expect at all, radically changed from one solely about intellectual histories to one that explored how voice and listening were crucial not only in determining the very concept of orality, O-R-A-L-I-T-Y, and folklore in the 19th century in different Latin American countries. I work on Colombian archives, but this is actually very similar in other countries. Of course, the particularities change. But they were also very crucial in determining concepts of what is human nature, who has a voice, what is animal nature, does the thunder have voice? Does the animals have voice? What type of voice is there? All concepts of culture and nature are mutually constituted. So I could not just work on the voice of these human sounds this way and then leave aside. There was a whole debate in the 19th century thinkers about what was going on. It has been explored by scholars such as Eduardo Gurinas. The history of nature in Latin America and the Caribbean is not the same as the history of nature in other places. And ethnographic explorations of the concepts of nature, as found, for example, in the work of geographer Astrid Ulloa, also have their particularities in the region. My more recent work then, I will go back to some of the examples, but just to sum up, my more recent work involves work with the use of sound with indigenous filmmakers, an anthropological and philosophical inquiry into the nature of the relation between myth, music, and sound. Particularly, I got very interested in the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, as read by more recent anthropological authors like Tania Stolze-Lima, Eduardo Viveiros, and others, because Claude Lévi-Strauss wrote a lot about music. But what I'll do now then is present that more historical work. I also work on issues of silence and confinement, but this is what I'll present today. The first, which is this material, which actually overturned a lot of my book, and that's where I went to reading about the 19th century. First material comes from Alexander von Humboldt as he travels down the Magdalena River in Colombia from the Caribbean to the Andes. On April 19, 1801, Alexander von Humboldt began his trip up the Magdalena River en route to Bogota, then the capital of the Viceroyalty of Nueva Granada. During this trip, he undertook experiments with the horrid-smelling vapors expelled from the mouths of crocodiles, wrote essays comparing the mosquitoes from the Orinoco, Rio Grande, and Magdalena rivers, contrasted the exuberant vegetation of the Magdalena riverside to the orderly growth found along the Rhine, and wrote observations on the more than 80 champanes, or boats, it's the boat you're seeing on your screen, that one could see transporting contraband to the beautiful riverine port city of Mompos and other cities of the Colombian Caribbean during times of peace. These episodes barely made it into his famous personal narrative of travels, a public account of his travels in the Americas that stops short of his journey from the Colombian Caribbean into the Andes. Thus, many of his thoughts and observations on Colombia remain part of his unedited diary until well into the 20th century. And perhaps due to its more intimate nature, the diary gives us a glimpse of those things that unnerved Humboldt. And try as he might, there was one thing that he found impossible to contain through scientific observation: the sound of the bogas, the boat rowers that you see there, of the Magdalena River. His positive impression of their tremendous physique and, quote, demonstrations of human force, which he would have, quote, liked to have to admire for less time. The trip from the Caribbean to Bogota took, if you were lucky, 1 month, but usually it was 3 months. Was muted by the sounds they made. And these are the sounds. I don't have a slide. I want you to listen to the quote from Humboldt. They are free men. Sometimes, it's a slave society, but they're free. Sometimes very arrogant, unruly, and happy. Their eternal happiness and their good nutrition, all of this diminishes the feeling of compassion for them. But the most upsetting thing is the barbarous, lustful, ululating, and angry howl, which is sometimes like a lament and sometimes joyful, at other times full of blasphemous expressions through which these men seek to handle their muscular effort. About this point, we can make quite a few interesting psychological observations. All muscular effort decomposes more air in the lungs than during repose. To bring more air into the lungs, it is also necessary to expel more vitiated air. That is why in heavy work, the emission of cries and sounds is quite natural. If the type of work has a regular cadence, then a psychological factor is added. The pleasure for cadence requires that the tones be expressed in a more determined way. How, hum, hum. If you add all that, you can imagine the tone can become a song and even a dialogue. Thus, the heavier the work, the more angry the howling of the bogas, among whom the cadence will be affected frequently by caprice. So this is a theory, he's citing a theory of origin of music that was hotly debated in the 19th century. There were 3 theories, I won't go into them. But this one is that labor, lowly labor, and these screams are transformed into more formal expressions such as dialogue and then song. Anyway, just to close, the racket you hear uninterruptedly until you reach Santa Fe de Bogota is as bothersome as the steps of the bogas on the roof of the champan, over which they stomp so loudly that frequently there is a threat of collapsing. Our dogs needed many days to get used to this unbearable racket. So there are the bogas there. This trip is going up to Bogota is countercurrent, and the Magdalena is quite a big river. So there was incredible labor. I won't go into more of the details. Maybe it's something we can describe later. So for Humboldt, scientific observation, the means of making sense of radical difference in an intensely heterogeneous context, was drastically unsettled by this descarga acústica, in the words of Julio Ramos, acoustic discharge, that made it impossible for him to interrupt the racket of the bogas. In this brief passage, sonic perception is pressed onto corporeal difference, scientific explanation, and the narration of uncontainable bodily produced noises, vocal utterances and stamping feet that penetrated the ears without interruption throughout the day over the course of weeks and sometimes months of travel. We also have the difficulty of deciphering a generic category of sound. Is this a lament? Is this a joyful type of expression? What about the blasphemy and the racket on the roof? It was a sound that was impossible to inscribe onto a music genre or onto a proper aesthetic emotion. Its untraceability begging for classification in Humboldt's ears. The bogas were historically classified. So let me just interrupt a little. So what happened is I got very interested in this fragment. This fragment is not music. This fragment is not speaking. This fragment, and I said, what is going on here? And I have no idea what to do with this, but I'm going to sit and, you know, the glories of being a tenured professor, and I'm going to read more. So I read about, I don't remember anymore. I read about 12 or 15 travel narratives in the 19th century down the Magdalena River and compiled all of the sounds of the bogas, right? And then from there, I developed, you know, how to think about their voices. But what is very, very interesting, it's that the problem that emerges is not only a problem of what counts as orality. So the bogas were the main transportation system. There's no way you can move in Nueva Granada without them, right? And yet they do not appear in any single contemporary music history. This sound was pervasive. This sound was prevalent. This sound was constitutional of the 19th century. Many people heard it because they were at the crossroads. You know, they transported everything and everybody in different rivers in Colombia. And yet this barely makes it into the music history of the country. So, or none at all. There's other bogas from others places mentioned in novels. So what to me then is, so they're not folklore. They're too unruly, they're well nutritioned, they're, you know, they behave how they want, and on top of that, they sound like animals. So, or they're not proper forms of orality. Orality was described in very different ways. You had to have pitch, you had to have melody, you had to have rhythm, a certain type of rhythm, and these people were not there. So they don't make it into music history. But more than that, there's much more. This material and other materials I found made me notice what had voices. Of course, there's a classic question here, and a question that also has been explored by people that work with slavery, the history of slavery. These archival materials for me to return to a classical colonial question of the Americas. Are these people human or not? How is it that they're considered human or animal? How do we classify them? Moreover, if their voices sounded like howls, like animal voices to the Creole and Western elites who heard them, in a definition in which the human is outside and above the animal, and the animal is considered a lowly creature, what about the understanding of the bogas themselves and the indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants of their own voice? Based on an ethnographic and indeed on archival evidence, we can see that a very different notion of who has a voice and of the human and the animal emerges when we take their respective notions of sound into account. So the other type of materials I have are, one, I try to analyze according to historical evidence, but also reading ethnographies from the plays. In a lot of musical ethnographies, people learn the songs from the birds, from thunder, from lightning. And not in all, but in some of them, imitating the voice of these animals is actually a desired trait and a very particular type of virtuosity. So the concept of music is not the same as the concept of music that prevails in ethnomusicology programs, in music departments. And this is not, at this point, only a problem of, let's send that to ethnomusicology programs. As Alex said, once you begin to question how they understood nature, not only music, you have to understand how these notions are mutually constituted. How a voice is understood plays a role in understanding not only the notion of orality or folklore, it also plays a notion in the definition of nature. And in the 19th century, since there was so much, quote, organization of nature going on, as in the words of Mauricio Nieto, historian of nature, there was also this organization of what would be the folklore of the nation. How would the nation sound? And they are mutually constituted. So there's no culture here and nature here. They are actually mutually constituted. And if one changes, then the other changes. So I'm going to show another fragment of the archive. Also Humboldt, just to stick to the same problematic, let's say. And I want to look briefly at another fragment from Humboldt, and this one found in his book, Views of Nature or Contemplations on the Sublime Phenomena of Creation with Scientific Illustrations. This is from 1850. It is a very long fragment. Of course, Humboldt is a very a topic for this because his writing is so sensorial. He listened. These are pages and pages of how this whole thing sounds. So I'm just citing a very, very brief part. And this is the trip to the Caciquiare, which is highlighted there, to the Orinoco River. This is part of that trip to the Orinoco in the 1850s. And he is credited with, quote, having discovered that little channel that connects the Caciquiare with the Amazon. But anyway, so here's the citation from that trip, and I move on. How many minutes do I have? I think I have about 5 more minutes. So it says, below the mission of Santa Barbara de Richuna, we passed the night as usual in the open air, on a sandy flat on the bank of the Apure, skirted by the impenetrable forest. Deep stillness prevailed, only broken at intervals by the blowing of the freshwater dolphins. After 11 o'clock, such a noise began in the contiguous forest that for the remainder of the night all speech was impossible. The wild cries of animals rung through the woods. And so there's a whole passage that I'm jumping, which is, this is the sound of the tiger, this is the sound of the monkey, this is the sound of everything. Among the many voices which resounded together, the Indians could only recognize those which after short pauses were heard singly. If one asks the Indians why such a continuous noise is heard on certain nights, they answer with a smile, quote, that the animals are rejoicing in the beautiful moonlight and celebrating the return of the full moon. So here you have and then Humboldt says, to me, the scene appeared rather to be owing to an accidental, long-continued, and gradually increasing conflict among the animals. Part of Humboldt's acoustic perception in this particular trip became a general law known as Humboldt's acoustic effect, which describes the increase of the volume of sound by night for the animals, and then lower temperatures, it's more silent at noon. Animals hide, they don't sound as much. And it was presented in a lecture to the Academy of Sciences in Paris in March in 1820. So for indigenous peoples, animals can have feasts, celebrate the return of the moon, so we have this differential understanding of how culture and nature are understood. I developed that in the book more. I'm going to leave that for now. There's multiple theories through which one can develop this. But just for me, what I think is important about this material is, one, how rich the archive, the Latin American archive, is about histories of sounding and voice. And that when one from the humanities or from music disciplines begin doing these histories, I ended up with a problem, which is, oh, this is not just a history of recognizing these unrecognized voices and sounds. This is also a problem of how nature is also being defined by how voices are heard, whether that be the voices of animals, the voices of spirits, etc. So in closing, I want to simply share one of the films that I have and filmmakers that I have been working with. I'm not talking too much about that because other people in this panel are talking more about indigenous peoples. I have not written much about this. More it has been participation of production and other forms of intervention, but let me just take this out, stop the share, and go back. And so since at least 1985, Latin America has a yearly film festival of indigenous peoples organized by the Latin American Coordination of Film and Communication of Indigenous Peoples, CLACPI, la Coordinadora Latinoamericana de Cine y Comunicación de los Pueblos Indígenas. It has a huge webpage. It is very rich. There's also national festivals every year. During the past 10 or 12 years, I've worked with primarily one indigenous collective in northern Colombia, today called Bunquayamunum Comunicaciones of the Wiwa people of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. The film Ushui, The Thunder and the Moon, which we presented at Columbia University and brought them, is a fragment. I'm going to present a fragment of that film to notice how listening is a particular site, again, of understanding who listens, who hears, and how is that constituted. So let me just share that fragment. I am sorry for giving so little background. We can give that background later. And let me go to share screen. Oop, I don't see the film. Let me just make sure. Let me just open the film, and maybe that way it'll appear. Okay. Now let me go back here. Can you see my screen?
No, I have it if you want me to share it.
Oh, here we go. Now it appears. Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. Can you hear it?
Umanamba pu kulash kalu imanja anja din tingega kenuga kinkimangu geshnanga ganuga kimangu ashe menga kul jamais kul mayene kanuga kima jinjino kwan kangwa kalga mba ikanaka ikanaji celular lumamba bigo manushi wala twaki jinja maintenu kangu meko anje bien me meng bikima ima gega nu kwani nu kangwa ikananje pungu yaki kalga shamuna wanka.
Okay, so again, the issue is that questions of listening bring up not only a question of culture, they bring up a question of nature. And audiovisual documentaries of indigenous peoples have this as a central dimension. And so one of my interests is how does the sonic participate in all of this? So the second issue is that notice how music does not reside in this object. Where is it? What are the spiritual fathers listening to? Where is that located? Else, I think we'll refer to that a little bit more, so I'm not going to go into that. I am going to leave my talk here. I'm not going to go into the ways I have analyzed this dimensions, a lot of this work with notions of multinaturalism as well, but also with other possibilities of analysis from theories of nature in Latin America and the Caribbean. What I'm most interested is in how these materials are used to reconceptualize a history of nature in Latin America and the Caribbean that is engaged also with dimensions of the cultural. And I think these materials then have this very, very profound possibility of being shared. The second, of course, is that these audiovisual documentaries bring incredible material of the very conceptualization of how ambient and the human and non-human, however we're going to call that, is understood. And as such, and also they're, of course, used for activism a lot. So there's all these materials that I think lead to questions of understanding. Also, what is climate change for them appears a lot in these materials. In any case, this is a dimension of my work. I think what I'm interested in continuing to do is working on these archival materials, but also on more recent work and exploring this Latin American history of sound and what counts as music, what counts as a voice, of how is the audiovisual conceived, that extends beyond simply a question of culture. It deeply involves, in the very formation of this material, questions of nature, and that listening is a very particular strong site to explore that. So thank you very much for listening, and I leave it to the other members of my panel.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anna.
Okay.
Just a reminder to those of you watching us in the comments section, leave your questions and they will be brought into the conversation after the last paper here. And I now want to turn to Els Legru, who's full professor of social and cultural anthropology at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in the graduate program of sociology and anthropology, and researcher at the National Center of Research. Somebody, if you could make sure your microphone is muted so that we can hear Els when it's her time. Her research interests include Amerindian ethnology, its ontology, social and aesthetic regimes, as well as the anthropology of expressive and agentive forms. She is the author of The Fluidity of Form, Art, Alterity, and Agency in an Amazonian Society, Indigenous Arts in Brazil, and she's also the author of the catalog for her curated exhibition at the National Museum of the Brazilian Indian, titled On the Bath of Glass Beads, A World Made of Beads. Her paper is Relational Ontologies in Indigenous Contemporary Art in Brazil. Els, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ronald. Well, I want also to thank, first of all, Vicky Murillo and also Anna and the colleagues for organizing this seminar and this particular panel. And rethinking nature and society from different perspectives seems to be more urgent today than ever before during the pandemic, and also from our point of view in Brazil, we are going through a tremendous social, economic, and ecological crisis. So I would have lots of things to link to reflections to link to Anna's presentation about how sound and vision operates the passage between and communication between the human and non-human beings. But for today, I prepared a reflection, a paper about the presence of contemporary indigenous artists on the scene of contemporary art, and that is a very recent phenomenon. So in the discussion we can make the connections, but I'm going to read what I prepared. So Brazil, the scene of an information war between worlds and their possible ends, and one of the main focuses of the current crisis caused by the Anthropocene, is seeing a vigorous movement in contemporary art being born, a movement that is managed by indigenous artists and intellectuals, and that is resolutely connective and collective. The critical situation of indigenous people in Brazil, threatened but more articulate than ever, allowed a cosmopolitan space of artistic creation to emerge that will not go unnoticed by the international art world. The movement operates an expansion from Amerindian cosmopolitics concerned with the negotiation of relations with and between human and non-human beings in the forest to the cosmopolitan environment of the big cities. The purpose is to imagine the possibility of creating other worlds based on post-extractive principles that celebrate community life, the living well, viver bem, a lowland version of the Andean buen vivir. And I want to make a small parenthesis here that a small new book of Ailton Krenek will be launched soon on the theme of buen vivir, viver bem, from the Amerindian perspective. And the respect for the animated and subjective nature of the non-human beings that inhabit the space that of what used to be called nature in opposition to culture. When the pandemic locked a great part of the world into a forced reclusion in Brazil, a virtual and multimedia network was activated and opened a space for the indigenous worlds to reveal their narratives and worldviews as alternatives for the impasse in which the modern Western model has led us. The coupling of human and non-human beings in an unbridled machine of capitalist production has proved to be the opening of Pandora's box that kept the epidemics at bay, which today spread to the four corners of the world. So this space really created an opening and a public of young people for discussions. In a recent interview of Moises Bianco a few weeks ago, Moises Bianco, the spiritual leader of the Ashaninka people of the Ammonia River in the state of Acre, by Ailton Krenak, Bianco argues that people destroy that which they do not know and cannot see. The moment has come to make people listen and see so that they can know and care for the life that is hidden in the forest, says Bianco. The situations of crisis can be moments of rupture, making inversions of perspective possible. In Brazil, the world seems to have opened its eyes for an indigenous art of living that has always been there to be seen, but only now found a means to make itself heard by a wider public, ready to learn from other experiences of living. Many of you must know the book, The Falling Sky, Words of a Yanomami Shaman, published 10 years ago by David Kopenawa and Bruce Albert. And in this autobiographical and ecosophical book, Kopenawa warns us about the danger for the world of the destruction of forests and rivers by gold miners in Yanomami territory, associating the exploitation of gold with the appearance of devastating epidemics and arguing that the disappearance of the shamans will enrage the Shapiri. And here I will start to share the screen to show some images. There we go. Can you see?
Yes.
Yeah. Shapiri, image beings, the shamans, auxiliary spirits that protect the forest, resulting in the collapse of the sky that will kill us all. The book, a masterpiece of poetic images, received a lot of attention from the national and international art world, as well as from a growing public attuned to the climate crisis. And there's a film called Shapiri related to the book. Omama and the Fall of the Sky is a painting made by Denilson Baniwa, inspired by Kopenawa's narrative for a groundbreaking exhibition in the Museum of Art of Rio in 2017, called Jaguataporã, Rio de Janeiro Indígena, co-curated by Sandra Benítez Guarani. The exhibition proposes to recount the history of Rio de Janeiro from the point of view of its indigenous inhabitants, principally those who live in the city today and not those who disappeared centuries ago. Another intellectual inspiration for the recent movement of indigenous contemporary art in Brazil is Ailton Krenak, one of the first indigenous leaders with supra-local expression, who founded the National Union of Indigenous People, and with Chico Mendes, the Union of the People of the Forest, a União dos Povos da Floresta, in the late 80s, an organization that joined the efforts of local rubber tappers and indigenous people to protect their forest against logging and cattle raising, and was an important precursor of environmental policies in the state of Acre and in Brazil as a whole. Krenak's speech, an iconic gesture we see here during the Constituent Assembly in preparation of the new Constitution of '88, a milestone for the conquest of indigenous rights in Brazil, has been promoted in recent art exhibitions as the artivistic gesture par excellence. Speaking softly, but with anger, to the assembled legislators, the young Krenak, dressed in an impeccably white suit, slowly painted his face black with chinipa paint, a declaration of war shared by many Amazonian indigenous peoples. More than 30 years later, in 2017, a meeting organized by Krenak and others in the Goethe Institute of Sao Paulo will be remembered by the young indigenous artists he had invited for a strategic discussion, as a cornerstone for the movement of indigenous artists conquering the established art world. In this meeting, emblems of Brazil's modern art movement of the beginning of the 20th century, such as the figure of Macunaíma, a hero without character of Maio de Andrade, and the anthropophagic manifesto by Oswald de Andrade, are discussed and denounced as modern versions of elite extractivism on the part of the Brazilian art world. As we will see further on, these discussions would lead to important artistic and curatorial innovations by the young artists present at the meeting. In 2019, Krenak publishes a small book, a result of lectures given in academic settings under the name Ideas to Postpone the End of the World. An enormous editorial success, the booklet is quickly translated into several languages, French, English, German, Italian, and becomes a bestseller in Brazil. The title and purpose of the book can be read as an alternative or a complement to the apocalyptic message contained in The Fall of the Sky by Schopenhauer and Danowski's and Vivers de Castro's The Ends of the World. Krenak imagines colorful parachutes for us to land in possible worlds, worlds that, to come into existence, depend on a profound change in our relation to other beings, the earth that sustains us, and the rivers, living beings that try to resist the growing aggression of big mining enterprises. It is worth knowing that the Krenak family lives at the borders of the Rio Doce or Watu, a river that disappeared under the avalanche of toxic mud when the Vale Dam broke near Mariana a few years ago in the state of Minas Gerais. An enormous ecological disaster. Until today, his community lives on water weekly supplied by the trucks. Indigenous people, says Krenak, have lived through several endings of their world since the European invasion in their territory. They're used to it and created resistance. They have learned, as Donna Haraway would say, to live in the belly of the monster. In his latest booklet, Life is Not Useful, written during the pandemic, Krenak defends the urgency of breaking the predatory pattern through which non-Indigenous people continue to relate to Indigenous people, to the point of not only trying to extract all the wealth from their lands, but also, in his words, to capture our subjectivity. Hence the importance of new Indigenous curatorships, which are springing up almost simultaneously in the great urban centers of Rio, Sao Paulo, and Belo Horizonte. And which show a concept of art capable of destabilizing a persistent distinction in the art world between art and life, art and artifact, between image, narrative, and song. Because one of the claims of these artists, when they exhibit an image or an object produced, is that they have to be present to contextualize with the performance and their narrative, and frequently the performance of songs to bring these objects to life. A step in this direction was the exhibition Veshua, We Know, in the traditional Pinacoteca of Sao Paulo, a place where up to now no Indigenous objects had been collected as art. Curated by Naine Terena at the end of last year, that is during the pandemic already, and where Indigenous artifacts, these powerful living things, dense condensations of relations and technologies and knowledge, shared the space with Indigenous contemporary art, showing that the Amerindian universe is itself an aesthetic, an art of living. Another example of this occupational space of visibility is the exhibition Cura, Circuit of Urban Art in Belo Horizonte, with curatorship by Arissana Patachon, where Dayara Tucano painted the biggest mural ever painted by an Indigenous artist, called Forest Mother of the River Boy, remembering that for water to exist, we need the forest, and that this relation is a spiral. In her words, The rivers are grandparents. Every grandfather has been a boy and every river has a mother. Jai as well, another prominent artist of the new generation, installed two giant inflated anacondas, sparkling with luminescent colors and designs, arching over a viaduct. He called them the entities. The installation evoked the fury of evangelical fundamentalists, enemies of the indigenous cosmopolitics of life, who threatened to destroy the airy sculptures. And then the artists went online at the Radio Yandé, a very important pan-indigenous Brazilian radio program, to comment the aggressions they suffered. As well also proposes a reinterpretation of Macunaíma, whom he calls his grandfather, and who is the quintessence of multiplicity and transformation, of the capacity to create new worlds, an entity that conquered Brazil by sticking to the cover of the book of by Mario de Andrade, and came back to stage today to invert the vector of capture in the work of Scheider, his grandson. Artist Makushi, and the Makushi are one of the peoples of Carib language of the region of Roraima that have Makunaimi as ancestor and protagonist of their myths of origin. If the missionaries translated Makunaimi as figure of the devil and modernism transformed him into the typical Brazilian, indigenous contemporary art reinvents its hero as master of transformation and of the invention of new forms, origin of the landscape of Roraima. With the same destabilizing impact, the jaguar shaman of Denilson Baniwa opens the eyes of his public, inverting the vectors of anthropophagy. Baniwa, at first by decapitating Mario de Andrade to open the way for Macunaíma. And in the same year, so all these exhibitions and works have been produced during the last 4 years. The next step was the exhibition of Sao Paulo, the Bienal, when the Nilsson Jaguar shaman appears placing flowers under the photos by Sofia Borges of the exterminated Secnam of the Tierra del Fuego, thus transforming the aesthetic contemplation of an anonymous image into a poignant critique of a silent genocide, because in the exhibition it had not been declared that the people had disappeared, had been exterminated. So I will, without too many comments, show some other images by De Nilsson. That Nature, the title disappears here from That Nature, Teresa Morta. Sorry, what happens here? In the same activistic key of affecting those who look without seeing, Naine Terena invited her visitors to put on the slippers of Terena victims who had been killed 10 years before by farmers' hired gunmen, and whose slippers the artist had kept as reminders, instruments to bring back the life of the phantoms of the past. The putting on of the slippers provoked a radical change of perspective in the visitors and moving some of them to tears. Every figuration carries with it virtual planes of becoming. In this scenario of evident and potent artivision, the trajectory of Maku movement of Huniquing artists from the Jordan River in the state of Acre occupies a unique and strategic place, since this art was conceived from the start as a multiple engendering of images of worlds in the process of transformation, which insinuate themselves in the relation between song, figure, and words inscribed on the canvas. The collective of Maku challenges, in the way of its being constituted, the notion of artistic authorship, a concept that is at the heart of the value system that sustains the art world. And they do it in multiple ways, not signing the paintings or collaborating with several people at the same time or inviting helpers to participate. So capturing in their web all kinds of chais, as they call by now most of the allies of indigenous people in Brazil, extending the Huniquing concept for affine, potential brother-in-law, to friends of the indigenous cause. Using the power of song and design, the Huniquing have been very effective in co-opting chais from helpers to curators and the museum public in Brazil and abroad. Here, names certainly do not denote fixed artistic entities, but rather lines of flights, traces, designs, and figures that are connected in webs of reciprocal reinforcement, masterly orchestrated by the conductor of the concert of human and non-human voices, Iban Huniquing, the leader of the movement, who usually does not paint, but sing. And he sings the songs of the ancestor in the voice of the owner of the shamanic substance, Yuba, the anaconda, who is a complex and multiple enunciator. He himself, the voice of the forest. The rhizomatic web of figurations, canvases, and murals produced in the vicinity and in resonance with the songs of Yuba, for the Huniquing, the cosmic master of connection and transformation between different forms and beings, depends on the belonging of the participant artists to the shamanic universe in which the members of the Maku collective participate, and its context of teaching songs through painting. Iban learned the songs from his father, who had learned them from his father and father-in-law. These songs, Hunimaka, belong to the ritual intake by the Huniquing of ayahuasca, a potent and very well-known visionary agent, whose use is widespread in Western Amazonia. The myth of origin of the brood tells us that the ancestor of the Huniquing learned of the ritual when living with the anaconda people. When he wanted to go back, the ancestor, to his own people, the anaconda people take revenge and almost kill him. He still had the time to teach the songs to his kin before he died. From his buried body grew the vine and the leaves used to make the brew. This ancestor, a human, thus became subsequently anaconda and vine, besides transforming himself in other beings of the forest and of the sky above. The songs connect different levels of the world and of the cosmos. And this is the myth, but the ritual initiation of every new novice repeats the experiences of the ancestor. So the master of Hunimaka songs teaches through song how humanity partakes of all possible forms of life. And this ritual, the myth and the images produced by the Maku collective are a clear example of a contemporary indigenous art inspired by a relational ontology, an Amerindian relational ontology that does not conceive relations as having to be created between separate entities, but conceives relations as constitutive of the self, of every fractal being. Relational ontologies do not separate nature and culture because they do not conceive of the possibility of separating humans from the land and the rivers and from the substances they ingest, digest, and produce. but also because they consider themselves to be part of this wider web of living beings in constant process of metamorphosis, of other becoming through self-becoming and vice versa. And it is through, really basically through poetic and aesthetic means that indigenous peoples give form to these worlds of becoming. And so I wanted to conclude with just a last image of the Maku collective. And that is it. Thank you. I will interrupt sharing.
Thank you.
Okay.
Els, thank you. And wow, the beautiful images. They're amazing. I only have a few short comments. We have about 40 minutes left. So again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, the comments. You know, these papers offer new ways of sensing nature, you know, as the theme of this panel says, through a combination of indigenous, environmentalist, architectural, academic, and other ways of seeing and listening, shifting dominant culture away from its extractive drive, and kind of reconnecting, understanding nature, you know, not as other, sort of learning, relearning how to engage with, represent, recreate, design nature through the non-human, creating, writing policies and economics that are based upon this harmony between the human and the non-human, giving nature legal rights. I love this, Alex. This means reconnecting the human to nature and reconceptualizing space, images, music, sounds, bringing this into activism and corporate and public policy that is non-extractive and protective of the environment, defining, redefining nature's purpose, or reconnecting ourselves back to what nature was, is, could be. It's pretty simple. It should be pretty simple. We need clean air, water to drink, and the forest for removing greenhouse gases and generating oxygen. And we should be able to live in harmony with that idea, as these artists and thinkers in these papers tell us. All of these papers introduce us to a rich, diverse cultural production by artists, architects, designers, and activists, mostly indigenous, responding to issues of climate change, sustainability, clean water, protecting the forests, respect for indigenous heritage and culture, nurturing our planet through a combination of art and activism. Importantly, these artists, activists discussed today are increasingly influential, which is wonderful to see, that their voices are moving out of the local, out of the national, into this kind of global conversation, impacting discussions about the climate and environment. So I thank the three presenters for papers that I thought really wonderfully intersected. And I open it up for discussion, but I also want to open it up to Alex, Anna, and Els if they want to comment on each other's papers or ask each other a question, since you are sort of working in the same area, or I see incredible overlap between the three papers.
So what was the story about having to type in their questions? Is that something we have to do, or can we just talk?
No, you can talk. It's just if someone wants to. You can raise your hand or basically start talking. Yeah.
Go for it, Alex.
Anna, I love both of the papers. Thank you very much to Anna and Els. Anna, what, you know, I read a lot of information theory and I don't know much about ethnomusicology. But what is the relation between what you're describing as sound and what in information theory is described as noise? That in the channel, yeah.
Okay, that's a very good question. So let me, there's multiple answers, and I'm not an information theorist. That is, I'm not somebody that does the engineering of sound, but I have read the history of the engineering of sound. So I will answer from that perspective. So basically, you can get the sound wave and partition it and change it and do a lot of things. And one of the things you can do is, for example, effects that are considered, well, noisiness that are considered noise can be reduced. So the informatic question is very particular. There's a whole set of books on noise. It's probably one of the most studied topics in sound studies. And so what comes in is not only information scientists, but also, for example, the history of telephones has to do with reducing the sound wave to the minimal limit in which we can still hear each other without it becoming noise. So there's a whole history that has been done by scholars like Jonathan Stern and Mara Mills about this, how this has been done in sound. My colleagues in the Computer Music Center will probably answer that part of informatics better. But what I mean by sound is the following. Generally in music departments, the notion of music, which created the history of the concept of music that is used to underlay everything that we teach. Not only the history of Western music, but for example, concepts such as style, rhythm, melody is based historically on certain parameters of very classical Western music. Even with the history of avant-gardism in the 20th century that has broken all that, that has remained a province. You started, of a certain particular specialized field, which is contemporary, so-called contemporary Western art music. So what happens is, when you go into research these materials, the concept of music that is privileged cannot be used for these materials at all. It doesn't work. So that what happens is that you need to expand the concept, and thereby the question of sound comes in. And in order to problematize what counts as music for whom. And so these boundaries between music and sound anthropologically are shifting, technically keep shifting. And of course the history of noise is associated to many things, not only things like urban centers and the rise of noise policy, but it's associated also as well to something that is negative. There's a history, and there's a music genre called noise, of course. So it has many. It's a broad field of instruction. So I hope that helps a little bit. I would be. I don't want to go into the more informatics and engineering dimension of this all, because that's not my field.
So it's a categorical. So it's a categorical. Music is a categorical framework that one applies to sound. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, or the notion of music when one encounters other types of practices, and the understanding of nature that notion of music has is not the same one that exists in different parts. But what I'm more interested in is the fact that defines the discipline in very radical ways, especially as it exists in curricular levels and university departments. So the interesting thing about this is not just, let's say, the classical anthropological relativism proposal. This is our music, this is their music. It's actually the capacity of unsettling the very concept of music itself by bringing other dimensions, and thereby bringing the question. So could we then question what's rhythm and the way we've defined it? What's melody and the way we've defined it? What's etc. So that has happened through avant-garde art and through anthropology simultaneously throughout the 20th century. But a lot of the curricular dimensions remain very, very conservative and classical.
Vicky, then Ben?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of this panel in relation to the other two panels that we already had. And in particular, and I think Eduardo Udiñas is here, so maybe he probably can answer the question as well. This idea of recovering like the indigenous cosmology and in understanding the rights of nature, that's also particularly strong in Alex and Elle's presentation. Because what was interesting to me is even the idea of rights. It's a pretty Western, idea, right? So it does seem to me in thinking about nature like we felt it last time and we're thinking it now, that I mean, and I'm not, this is really outside my area in the sense of art, that you're really looking at the indigenous people from a pretty Western, in the sense of the conquest, right, perspective, in thinking about rights, in thinking about kind of international jurisdiction for Earth, which comes to issues about climate change, cooperation, even in thinking about art and museum exhibits, which again, it's like how we see the indigenous people in the non-indigenous world, right? It's not how you see it there. I mean, as I think Ana Maria's, the movie, that was different. The discussion of the Constitutional Convention and bringing someone who's dressed in white, but there he paints his face in black. So the contrast, but all the time, and even in Ana Maria's, the categories, as the discussion that we just had show, is really a pretty Western reading of trying to recover the indigenous understanding of nature as one of the many possible understandings. I mean, I thought it was super powerful, all of the readings. But again, as someone who's looking totally from outside the art, and so, you know, this is the first time I'm seeing it, and that's kind of the view. That's why call my attention, and how that, so how are we seeing nature from that view, but still from our view that's different from that view? I don't know if I make any sense in what I'm saying.
You know, Els, Anna, Alex, do you want to respond to that? Yeah, Els?
Maybe I can try a first answer. I think Anna and Alex can answer in different ways. Actually, what I have tried to do in this paper is to literally cite what these recent activists, artivists have combined as a collective strategy to assault the art world and to question the presuppositions of the art world. So I think these people like Ailton, these intellectuals like Ailton Krenak, Denilson Baniwa, and Jiders Bell, they are very well prepared to undertake a philosophical and political debate about all these difficult questions, how the West defines nature, how they propose to define nature, how the West defines art, and how they propose to reappropriate the image that has been produced about indigenous people. And this is something very new in Brazil, because they are entering not via the cultural definition of indigenous art as popular art. They're entering the field art, and in collaboration with young people, curators of the most important centers of the art world. So I think, for example, the definition of living well, and there are several concepts that have been very important in ethnology to understand Amerindian cosmology. So this is the importance of a conception of the centrality of predation in the production of life, so that you have to kill to produce life, and so they have turned upside down all these images also that can also be found in the literature, like the predation and otherness is very important for indigenous thought. So that's why they especially Ailton Krenak, who's a very sophisticated intellectual, has picked out all these concepts: bem viver, predation, David Kopenawa has also turned upside down the concept of predation and of responsibility of the production of epidemics, and these through his analysis from a shamanistic point of view, from Yanomamo point of view. So I think these discourses are very in symphony with the recent ontological turn within anthropology, the formulation of the concept of multilateralism, of perspectivism. I don't know whether I answer you, but they are dialoguing with the literature, with the discussion of Latour about Gaia, with Vives de Castro's proposal. These dialogues are very very explicit. Yeah.
So I'll just give a brief answer because I think other people want to participate. Or Alex, do you want to speak now? No? Well, indigenous people live in the contemporary world. So they participate of our institutions. They participate, they have video cameras. They want to use video cameras. They have cameras, etc. So my experience is, and that's the type of experience is that, and also the way they deal with a political institution always involves a deep knowledge of those institutions, and as well, so you can simultaneously work with those institutions' concepts and their own concepts. So a word can mean more than one thing. If we're using the word music, if they don't, they can use it for talking to us, even though the word music doesn't exist amongst them. It's the word song or the word voice or some sort of translator that functions in two ways at the same time, okay? So that happens with everything else. So one of the experiences, for example, with cameras is they're brought into the world in a particular way. We think we're taking technology. They think, no, you're not. These things have always existed. They've always been in our world. The only thing that is happening right now is that they're materializing into our world. And in order for them to materialize property, we need to, like where I work, they baptize them, they do a series of things in order to have a place in the world that they create. For us, and then in the development paradigm, those are new technologies. For them, nothing is created anew. Yet they then can incorporate those technologies through a different parameter of understanding them, or through the same one as ours. So, or both at the same time. So I just want to say that these things operate with more than one meaning, more than one strategic deployment of the material at the same time. And that this reference either to cosmology or to the literature or to the way the constitutions are constituted, which is, Eduardo has his answer raised, so he will tell us more about that, etc., is a constant transformation. Also, notice the comparison they give. Oh, the way my song is heard is like when you are talking on the cell phone. So the notion of the virtual, it's like, that's what for us would be the notion of the virtual. I can be heard here, we cannot see them, but I can be heard. Oh, it's like when you talk on the phone. So there's also a lot of reverse anthropology. There's also a lot of talking back to us about how we should conceive the world. Like Elsa's work and a lot of the films that I work with are considered pedagogical for us. That is, if the film were being made for them, they would make a completely different film that doesn't need to speak and talk in different ways, but they want the films to be seen to the outside. And so this is a different historical phase of film production. And in the 1980s, a lot of it was meant for, specifically for the communities, to have pedagogical materials for indigenous schools, for example. But here it's different. And so there's a lot of reverse anthropology happening at the same time. So that's a short answer for a very good question, Vicky.
It's a great question. I want to make sure that we get all comments and questions in. So forgive me, I'm going to do 2 and 2. So Ben and Gustavo, if you want to make your comments, questions, first Ben and then Gustavo.
So just what a powerful panel this was, and many issues that are raised. And I think there's really a logic that we began with some of the more conventional issues around nature, development, resources, sustainability, and we now have this. And how fortunate that this is only the second of the five, because I think this, in a way, is the most important. It's the one that most opens up a space. And so, like Vicky, I'm interested in exploring the connections, and I think we really there are so many points of connections. More will become available. Initially, some of the things people were saying, well, there's artists and activists, and there's different ways of talking about this, or the Constitution and the museum recites where Indigenous people can claim a presence. But I think there's something more. I think the point of voice and listening is coming forward. Some of the questions of the whole rethinking of sustainability in the era of climate crisis brings forward just what the meaning of what the elements of nature are. And I think this kind of reverse anthropology that Anu is mentioning, reverse ethnography, I think is a really powerful point, that it's not merely saying, here's our music, here's our art, we want this to have rights too. It's really a much more reconstitution. I guess I'll add that though this has highly specific Latin American contexts, it's also striking to see the parallels elsewhere. And just to mention two of those, Elsa's images are reminding me of the huge expansion of Aboriginal art in Australia, and sort of the retention both of deeply Indigenous forms and yet the use of media and some conventions of reworking those. And then I don't think it's a coincidence that the Agin Kausai, the Buen Vivir, is more or less simultaneous with the appearance of gross national happiness in Bhutan, that coming out of this ethnic corner of the Himalayas is another kind of alternative knowledge that's speaking back to development, a very in-your-face speaking back. So I think we want to see these with the Latin American specificities, and yet also recognize how these are global as well as Latin American crises.
Gustavo?
Great panel, loved all the talks. I just had a few kind of interrelated questions or provocations for Alex, and others can answer as well, just about kind of the notion of ecocentrism. And in some ways this kind of repeats some of what Vicky brought up, but in a slightly different register. So I guess some of the questions that kind of came to mind in hearing the presentation was like, you know, is an ecocentric perspective actually realized through the concept of non-human rights? Is ecocentrism just sort of a mystification of a disguised and socially exclusionary anthropocentrism? And you know, I guess what I'm getting at is this sort of radical notion of non-human rights compatible with the assumptions of like individuality and boundaries of possession that's encoded in political legal conceptions of rights? I guess, you know, I think the idea of ecocentrism has kind of a lofty aspirations, but when connected within ideas about property and rights, that there may be some fundamental incompatibilities there. And I guess the last layer of questioning that I wanted to bring up is just, is the idea of ecocentrism even possible? Or is it just kind of a romantic projection or misrepresentation of other ontologies that is recursively mimed for not so radical political projects? Again, I was thinking mainly of Alex, but I think all of the talks kind of dialogue with these kinds of questions in different ways.
But yeah, but Gustavo, I think if you went back a few hundred years, you could say the same thing about rights of humans, right? Rights of man, a romantic idea. Is it really practicable? I mean, these things are argued and through the process of argumentation are settled. I might point out that there are two constitutions now, the Ecuadorian constitution and the Bolivian constitution, that have instituted these rights. I mean, so it's not just an idea. I mean, now it's a legal principle. Whether or not it's followed from one government to the next, or whether it was followed by the initial governments, is something that I'm going to leave to the experts. And, you know, it's great that Acosta is coming. Alberto Acosta is speaking here. He was one of the writers of the Ecuadorian constitution that actually instituted rights to nature. So You know, I mean, it's something worth fighting for. And I don't think I'm the only one that believes that. In fact, I know I'm not the only one that believes that. And so it's a matter of allowing people allowing that to open up in the mind space of more and more people, that actually it's in everybody's interest to institute rights. I mean, think about it. Corporations have rights. That took a long time to bring that into being. I mean, you know, in the US law, a corporation has rights. Well, you know, it's really not, I mean, I follow the logic of some of these people that Tavares interviews. I mean, it's really not, if corporations can have rights, why would we think it's too romantic to give rights to nature? So yes, it's still in the ideal stage, but it's also very possible, and something I would argue worth fighting for.
If you'll forgive me, I'm going to bring in Eduardo's comments and Esther just in case we run out of time, but we want to hear Eduardo and Esther.
Okay, well, thanks very much. These are very nice presentations. And I will follow Anna's point about the diversity of the indigenous groups to enter modernity, to enter the legal system. And can I do this in Spanish or I must speak in English?
I think, I don't know, what anybody has a problem?
Because I would like to add some clarification to very specific points and also to address that issue on the ecocentric. So my first clarifications, I'm now turning to Spanish. Porque tiene que ver con lo que ustedes discuten. En Bolivia no se reconocieron los derechos de la naturaleza, pero por alguna cuestión misteriosa, en el norte creen que se reconocieron los derechos de la naturaleza en la Constitución. Y de hecho, buena parte de la disputa política dentro de Bolivia sobre gestión y políticas ambientales tiene que ver por ese problema constitucional. Incluso, si ustedes leen realmente la Constitución de Bolivia, el mandato de la Constitución es aprovechar la naturaleza. Esos artículos parecen escritos por ingleses del siglo XIX. Hay varios artículos que dicen que el mandato es aprovechar hasta el último recurso natural para industrializarlo. Entonces, esa circunstancia no se resolvió. En el caso de Ecuador, el reconocimiento de los derechos de la naturaleza fue siguiendo un recorrido, un camino distinto al que acertadamente ustedes han comentado, por ejemplo, de extender derechos humanos a corporaciones. Y creo que es clave esta distinción. En Ecuador se reconocieron los derechos de la naturaleza porque para ciertos actores de los pueblos indígenas, la naturaleza era sujeto. Ese era el punto de partida. El inicio no era extender derechos humanos para incorporar a lo no humano. El recorrido fue otro. La naturaleza ya era un sujeto y al ser un sujeto, inmediatamente debía ser asignada con derechos. Y este es un quiebre fundamental con el pensamiento moderno en cualquier tradición, porque el pensamiento moderno indica que solo los seres humanos son agentes de valoración, son agentes de valor, solo ellos son sujetos. Es por eso que en la Constitución de Ecuador la sección de derechos de la naturaleza está en paralelo con la sección de derechos humanos que incluye derechos a un ambiente sano. Van en paralelo. Eso explica el concepto de Pachamama, que está muy bien en la ponencia que presentaron esas advertencias. Naturaleza o ambiente son siempre performativos. se construyen desde actores sociales. Entonces, la definición de Pachamama no es traducible a la de naturaleza. Y esa definición, esa concepción se convierte en una disputa política porque está inmediatamente asociada a la apropiación de recursos naturales, que es clave para la economía. Por ejemplo, en la sesión pasada, Walter Bethgen hablaba de las praderas naturales en Uruguay. Pero lo que aquí en Uruguay se llaman praderas naturales son praderas muy modificadas, no son wilderness, para nada. Y esta disputa es tan potente que de hecho las reacciones de los grupos político-partidarios que apoyaban al gobierno de Evo Morales en Bolivia o de Rafael Correa en Ecuador luchaban por redefinir qué es Pachamama para poder seguir haciendo explotación petrolera o minera. Entonces, en esta diversidad de ambientes quiero hacer, me parece, otro aporte para ustedes. Las definiciones, concepciones, como visiones que hay entre pueblos indígenas son muy distintas entre ellos. Por ejemplo, las referencias de Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, cuando yo hablo con Eduardo, sus referencias al ambiente, a la madre tierra que él rescata de pueblos de Brasil, de pueblos amazónicos, por ejemplo, son muy distintas de las concepciones de pueblos andinos, muy distintas. Comenzando, por ejemplo, que por los andinos son pastores intensos en utilizar el ambiente. Entonces, hay a su vez una diversidad entre esas concepciones no occidentales de ambiente, naturaleza, Pachamama, etc. Y para que sus vidas sean un poco más complicadas, los indígenas tampoco tienen coincidencias, ni todos piensan o sienten lo mismo dentro de una propia nacionalidad sobre estos asuntos. Por ejemplo, ayer en Bolivia estalló un severo conflicto porque grupos indígenas campesinos que quieren hacer minería están en contra de nuevas normas que protejan la naturaleza en Bolivia. Entonces, esto no es una disputa de una empresa transnacional del norte que llega a Bolivia. Es una disputa entre sectores populares o grupos indígenas o campesinos. Otro ejemplo es el candidato que acaba de obtener el primer lugar en Perú, Castillo, implica una visión de la naturaleza propia del modernismo también del siglo XIX. Por ejemplo, él se presenta como de una izquierda tradicional, reivindica los usos nacionales de los recursos naturales, pero quiere legalizar, por ejemplo, toda la minería informal o ilegal que se practica en la Amazonía, lo cual tendrá enormes impactos ambientales y sociales. Y finalmente, esta cuestión del ecocentrismo y del biocentrismo, aquí las palabras importan, porque son conceptos muy distintos. Porque la visión ecocéntrica da un privilegio a una mirada de delimitación del ambiente basada en ecosistemas, basada en la mirada de la ciencia occidental convencional que delimita ecosistemas y otorga importancia o relevancia por aspectos de especies en peligro, amenazadas y así sucesivamente. Es una tradición potente en varios países del hemisferio norte, por ejemplo en Estados Unidos y en Canadá, por quienes se involucran en estos temas. En cambio, la postura que parte de la naturaleza como sujeto es una visión biocéntrica. No hay una delimitación previa de ecosistemas o de unidades ecológicas como tales. y al no haber previa es culturalmente relativa, depende de cada cultura, de cada sitio, de cada contexto histórico y ecológico. Esos eran mis aportes.
So,
Sorry.
yes, go for it. Can I just bring in Esther's question? Then I want to let all three of you respond to whatever you've heard. And Els, I'll start with you. Esther, your quick comment?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this great panel and this great conference. I just wanted to say that I think Els, everybody, they brought up this knowledge that is produced now in Latin America with the indigenous people. So it's not that they're bringing up, they are simply bringing up their original aboriginal ways of thinking, but they are intervening in the public sphere, in our contemporary debate. They are intellectuals and artists who are speaking to us in our own terms, bringing their background. And that's why their discourse is so powerful. If you read Schopenhauer and if you read Krenak, it's amazing how this reverse, it's because they're doing reverse anthropology. They are talking about the white. They are talking about us. And they're constructing the white. We don't talk about the white. We talk about Latin America. We are talking about Latin America. They are talking about the white. It's another concept. They don't talk about Brazil. I don't know why. I'm sorry about the noise. So I just wanted to stress what I think their message is, and I think it's being brought in very enlightened ways by our panelists. And I think it speaks to what our last week panelists were talking about in very powerful ways. So I think it's great to have this transdisciplinary approach.
Els? Yeah, Els, you want to respond?
Oh, yes, I just thank you, Esther, also for the comment. And I just wanted to make a short comment on Eduardo's observations that Amazonian and lowland South American people think very differently about how these non-human beings would be human. They have a very different vision on that. There is no such concept as Pachamama. Related effectively to the fact that these people are hunters and they don't and they're not pastors. So the hunting philosophy has at its center the notion of transformation, that the identity is in the body, so that after that, for some people, the person becomes transformed in the game that will feed the surviving skinned people. So first of all, we have a notion of myths and of original knowledge that stresses the fact that humans can occupy different bodies, and also that all territories, the river, the forest, have their owners, and these owners protect their beings. But there is a very strong emphasis on metamorphosis, on the and so what is happening now in Brazil is that a true a very renewed interest on the part of non-anthropologists of the art world and in general, because of the extreme climate crisis and ecological crisis we are living, and very that the public is much more open than ever before to listen to indigenous intellectuals, and they are doing exactly that, reverse anthropology. And these different people, like David Kopenawa, has a very different knowledge of the urban world than Ailton Krenak. So what is fascinating about the movement that is happening in Brazil now is that these people are through the media, because that's something that I wanted to start also. I showed classical paintings, but the filmmaking, indigenous filmmaking, is very important in Brazil for the moment also, and the musical movement also. But so they are very connected, and there is a movement going on of promoting each other, like a very important artistic prize is called Pipa Online. The different indigenous leading figures, they have organized live encounters to promote Isael Machacali, who is a very talented filmmaker, but not politically and intellectually articulated to compete in the art world. So I wanted just to stress this emphasis of the Brazilian indigenous movement on the extreme internal diversity of cosmologies, and that's why they say that everybody of every group is different, and these different forms imply different worlds. So this multinatural worldview is evident when you see David Kopenawa, Moises Pianco, Krenak talk, because Krenak will say for us, this river is a living being, and he speaks to us in dreams. So songs and sounds are the bridges of communication between different beings. So if you want to talk with the plants or persons, you have to sing if you want to. So this whole undefined specter between talking, singing, and producing onomatopoeic sounds are related to very specific Amerindian techniques of communicating with these non-human beings. So I think, yes, the problem is that now they're trying to make themselves be heard and understood by a lay public, and apparently they're being very successful. It's something new in Brazil for the moment. Yeah.
Forgive me, we're really out of time, but I want to give Anna and Alex a chance to respond, and then we'll close after their responses. Anna?
Actually, no, I'm okay. I've
Oh,
already
Anna,
been
yeah,
several
because
times.
yeah, we can take a few minutes, Anna. You can take a couple of minutes, you, and a couple of minutes, Alex. Yeah,
Just
because
one very short comment then, and it's that we didn't talk about this, but I think all of us are also dealing with the problem of art rights, music rights, how to build a sound archive, how to build a film archive. And it's a huge discussion. And the discussion goes, so I bring that in because that has a legal dimension. How do you promote this? How you do distribute it? What is property under this regime? How come the archives have to be, for example, together with the health archives in one of the communities that I work with? So I just wanted to bring that to sort of contribute to maybe the continued discussion of rights, because the notion of heritage is, what is it? All of these are also involved in the work we do. So just as a point of maybe future discussion and conversation, what are the rights of nature? What are the rights of artworks or productions? Or where do we store them? And how do we sell them or not sell them or share them or distribute them? And anyway, all of that in this intersection of institutionalities, I think it's a really interesting debate also for us to continue the conversation.
Alex, the last comment?
Yeah, for me, just that there's no shortcut to explaining some of these really complex issues, but I've learned a lot in this discussion already. So I really look forward to the next few weeks.
then let me thank you all. Alex, Anna, Els, for wonderful papers, for this wonderful discussion. Come to the next session. I love these Friday afternoon sessions to spend time with you and to go away and contemplate and to come back. So again, thank you all.
Thank you all for coming. Remember, next Friday, we have the panel on governance and interventions. This has been a fantastic session. I also share Ron's. I learned so much as Alex. I think this has been an enlightening conversation. I hope to see everyone next Friday again. Thank you.